Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sally Fletcher, Head of Online Events for SSON, and I'm delighted to be hosting this session today. So before we get started on this really interesting topic, a few quick housekeeping notices from me. So the console you see before you is fully customizable. You can zoom in on those slides if you want to see anything closer. There's also a Q&A box to the left-hand side of your screen, and I do encourage you to ask questions throughout the session. We've reserved some time at the end, but both our speakers are here live, so let's try and make it as interactive as possible. If you do have any technical problems during the session, then me and my colleague Ashley are on hand as usual to help, and you can pop that into the Q&A also. And finally, there's that resource center, so if you want to download any additional materials, you can do. So we are discussing today the topic of supplier relationship management. So you can see there, are you a difficult customer? Have a think about it. 5 ways to build a win-win relationship with your suppliers and create dramatic results. So when I was putting this webinar together, we thought a lot at SSON about the kind of topics we talk about on a day-to-day basis. So we do a lot of conferences and webinars on things like automation, customer experience, global business services, process excellence, and the huge impacts that those can have on your organization. But one thing we don't really talk about is your obligations as a customer or supplier relationship management and how that can impact your business. What I noticed when I was doing my last few conferences is that with the global business services leaders that had focused more on supplier relationship management throughout the pandemic, they had fared a lot better. So we wanted to gather together a couple of experts to talk to you about supplier relationship management and how you can build a trusted supplier. So those people that had that during the pandemic that also had that good relationship, they were able to negotiate discounts, extensions when needed, and generally just had a better end-to-end process. So we thought it was high time we discussed this topic. I asked you to think about your obligations as a customer. So we've invited 2 experts in procurement and supplier relationship management to join us today and share some tips on how to build that win-win relationship. So we're going to be talking today about discovering and serving up real value add for suppliers, finding the perfect balance between upstream customer efficiencies and seller challenges in change management, maximizing that ROI with seller onboarding, and eliminating portal fatigue with your suppliers. So some really good topics. Our speakers for today, we've got not one, but 2 great speakers. First up is Matt McLaughlin. He is the Director of Supplier Success at Tradeshift. So Matt leverages our deep background in the software and services space to help guide global clients in capturing hidden value as it relates to invoice-to-pay processes between their buyers and the supply chain. His focus is to understand the challenges faced by global corporations and provide practical, time-tested strategies that not only help increase productivity and drive significant cost savings, but also facilitates the organization's digital transformation of the AP process. And he's joined by Kanda Rosia, the former Senior Vice President for Global Procurement and Real Estate at NTT Security. She's also an independent consultant and supplier management expert, so we're really lucky to have her on the call. Kanda has over 30 years of industry experience, and previously as CPO and Vice President, as I said, for First Data Corporation, where she led the centralization and globalization of strategic sourcing and procurement, and the operational transformation of real estate and facilities management worldwide. She's got IPO, acquisition, spin-off, strategic procurement, and business transformation experience in the US and across the world. So really great to have her on the call. So let's dive into our topic today. So one of the things that we notice, and you probably will have seen this statistic before, is that over 70% of digital transformation projects fail. We hear that a lot, and why is that? What we're going to do today is zoom in on one particular digital transformation. That's the transformation of the supplier relationship management and procurement function. I want to kickstart with our first question, and that is, how is intelligent automation and digitization helping companies improve their supplier relationships? I'm going to go to you, Kanda, first. What do you think about that? And also, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks so much, Sally. It's great to be on the webinar today. I think that's a great question, and the whole process of digitization and the journey that companies are going on in terms of an intelligent automation journey, I think is absolutely having really positive impacts, certainly across the organization, but specifically on supplier relationships. And of course, my background and the perspective I'm looking at that from is of course from the company, from the customer perspective. And I think that what digitization at a high level allows companies to do is to automate tasks and processes that are both repetitive or I'm going to say lower value. And it's not to say they're low value or they're no value, but they're more tactical and less strategic. And in doing that, it then frees companies up to be able to focus their time, whether it's from a business stakeholder perspective, from the accounts payable and finance team, or from the procurement and sourcing team, to focus time on the strategic activities that really bring big value to companies. And as a part of that, really spend the time that they have and their energy with their suppliers on creating collaborative partnerships, as opposed to dealing with what are really sort of the administrivia that needs to go on between a supplier and a customer.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, is there anything that you would add to that?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Kanda, and thank you, by the way, Sally, for having us today. I appreciate this opportunity. I agree 100%, and you know, when you look at digital transformation, there's a huge opportunity to really automate those tactical transactions, the tactical functions, and freeing up more time to be more strategic. But we do have a way to go. You know, there's some study that was done by Forbes kind of identifies that all of buyer-supplier collaborations, 47% of them fail, and they fail due to the lack of trust that suppliers have with buyers. This is what we're getting at. Are you being a good customer? And it's an opportunity that if we focus in on that, the rewards are huge for both sides as we get on these transformation journeys, if you will. You know, you just think about some of the other statistics when we start to talk about the tactical work that's done and how a digital transformation project can eliminate it. You know, when you look at organizations, close to a quarter of folks' time dealing with suppliers is just really spent on inquiries, phone calls, support. And here we are in an age of self-service. And we should really be looking at how we can apply self-service to our suppliers and or partners, for that matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember when I first spoke to you, Kanda, you talked a lot about how suppliers can really make or break your business, and how most suppliers aren't one-offs. They're really people that you come back to time and time again. So I think it's so important to look at how we maybe eliminate or automate the transactional, as you said, and have more time building that relationship, but that we don't really think about, to be honest. Well, I definitely don't in our day-to-day. So really, really interesting. So another question I'm going to direct to Kanda is that most companies have ERP or P2P systems. Is that sufficient for suppliers? And maybe we can go to you, Kanda, first, or then to you, Matt.
Sure.
Okay. Thanks, Sally. You know, I've heard that question so many times in my career, internally with a company, where you're looking at various type of systems that can augment your ERP or your P2P or even source to pay. And one of the questions that I think often comes up is, yeah, but we have an ERP. Isn't that enough? And I think that as relates to supplier management, the answer is no. I think it's absolutely crucial to have an ERP or a P2P system, and that's your foundational level. And it may, and my analogy may fall apart, but if you think of it like a house or a building, that's your foundation, that's your basement subfloor area. It might even be your ground floor. But when you then get to say, you get to the point of saying, I need to have specialized areas in my house. And in this case, it's the tools and systems and transparencies and visibilities that help enable supplier relationship management. Typically, and in my experience with a number of ERP and P2P systems, they provide a little but not enough. It's like giving you a hint, and they're almost always, not entirely, but almost always from the customer's perspective. And they haven't really looked at the question and the challenges of supplier relationship management from the supplier's side. And knowing that for most companies, you have hundreds, if not sometimes thousands of suppliers. And so my experience is that the ERP is a great foundation, but it's definitely just a beginning step in the digital journey that you need to take.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all we hear a lot is customer experience. And I think a lot of the work we do on processes and automation is geared towards that. So yeah, I totally agree. And Mike, you're coming from the supplier perspective. What do you think? You must have a good finger on the pulse when it comes to solutions and technology in this space.
Sure. I'd have to agree with everything that Ken had just said. And, the foundation analogy is perfect. But you hit on something that's very, very important. And that is, who's the intended beneficiaries of an ERP system or the P2P system? And it's the customer or it's the buyer. Not so much external folks that are participating and collaborating in the work. And that's where the opportunity exists today to extend, if you will, what you're doing in your P2P and your ERP systems to your supply base so that they are willing, able, and happy to participate in that platform with you.
Brilliant. Yes, absolutely. Great. Let's go on to our next question. So the next question I'm going to direct first to you, Mike, so let's just ring the changes. So according to a recent study from Arent Partners, 25% of suppliers have implemented e-invoicing, which to me seems very low. I'm not in the industry, but it does seem startlingly low to me. So why aren't suppliers adopting e-invoicing in greater numbers?
It is, unfortunately, the stats prove it that, 25% are actually doing e-invoicing. So I guess on the flip side, 3 out of 4 of your suppliers aren't. And when you're not digitally connected, it just means more manual activity going on. When we think about a post-COVID, emerging out of post-COVID, and only 25% of our suppliers are connected with us, that's not good enough anymore as we go forward. And there is a need that you need to connect digitally and start working digitally with your partners on a global basis. When we start to see some of the reasons why, I have a hypothetical for you. If I had asked you, Sally, will you go to the gym every morning at 7 a.m.? You probably wouldn't, right? Even though it's probably good for you.
I definitely wouldn't.
Yeah, you wouldn't. And there's a book out called Change or Die by Alan Deutschman, I believe, is the author. And what he found is it's 1 out of 9 people won't make a change if they're asked to, even if it would mean their life expectancy would be longer. They could fix certain ailments, hypertension, diabetes. they just won't do it. And suppliers are similar. We as human beings aren't wired just to change when we're asked to. With suppliers, there's a cost. There's a cost to learn a new program. There's a cost to new processes and integrate. And a lot of times, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. They don't get the value, and they can't justify doing the cost. And it's something that needs to be looked at, because organizations will never achieve 100% digital unless they take into account their supply base, which in a digital transformation, and you're looking at supplier collaboration, is probably one of the most important constituents in that project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, definitely, we've mentioned the mindset and the challenges with that. What can we do to change that? I mean, Candace, is there anything that you can add to that in terms of, how can we get people to adopt e-invoicing in greater numbers, or, any other challenges that you've come across in your time as to why people aren't adopting it?
And by the way, I agree with everything that Max said, and, change, whether it's business change or personal change, it's way harder than it should be. And some of that is reluctance and other things. But one of the things that I'm seeing increasingly with companies, and certainly that I've used myself, is starting to bring up the requirement, not just the nice suggestion, but the requirement for things like e-invoicing in, for example, an RFP process, and also including it in the discussions, in the onboarding, in perhaps even contract language. E-invoicing is something that and I've had this conversation with a number of suppliers, say, can you do e-invoicing? And they quickly say yes. And sometimes that means they think if they send you an email with a PDF that they've done e-invoicing. And so some of it is I think incumbent on a customer to set forth their expectations early on, whether it's as a part of the tender or certainly as you're embarking on the relationship with the supplier, and lay out the expectations. And as a part of that, you can explain and help articulate not only what do we as the customer benefit from that, but why is that beneficial to the supplier? And sometimes you can actually see the light bulb click on. Yeah. And I've found that the gentle suggestion is often not as results driven as actually saying this is a requirement to do business with us. And certainly that may not apply to every small supplier, but particularly for your large global suppliers and the suppliers with whom you really want and need that mission critical strategic partnership. They're going to understand it. They're going to know the value. And if you say, it's my expectation in doing business with you, I found that's a really successful way to position it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've just hit on something really important with when you say global. I mean, a lot of us are dealing with global organizations, global customers, global suppliers, and asking someone to do something nicely or saying it would be a nice to have doesn't always resonate in cross-cultural business relationships. Sometimes you need to be specific, lay out your requirements, as you said, and lay out what's in it for them or what's in it for me with that beneficial part that you said is super important. And we're finding that more and more as companies globalize and we have our partners and customers where we haven't met them in person, but we've had these relationships remotely and built them remotely. Brilliant.
Sally, and adding to Candace's comments, I really like incorporating the e-invoicing in an RFP or contractual, but at the same time, I'd offer up that you provide those suppliers a soft landing with that. And what do we mean by that? First of all, if you're going to have them use your e-invoicing system, there has to be no cost to the supplier. If the suppliers are going to have to pay for something like this, there's automatically going to be a wall that's put up, and you're not going to achieve it. So you got to look at a solution that's free for the suppliers to use. You also have to look at how you can minimize the process change with these suppliers. A lot of suppliers aren't large like you are, or the buying companies. They're SMEs. They're small to mid-sized businesses. They don't have necessarily the resources. They don't have the money to make a change. So make it easy for them. As mentioned earlier, yes, some folks think sending a PDF email is electronic invoicing. Well, make it easy for the supplier and have the right tool on your end when you receive that PDF invoice to turn it into an electronic document or e-invoice document. You also want to create what I would call universal value for suppliers from day one. What do suppliers want? They want visibility into their invoice status, into their payment status. They want to get paid as soon as they can. They want to get paid within their terms. What you could be doing immediately, value, is providing that visibility. Remember, I spoke about self-service. Let's give self-service to the supplier with updated information on their invoice and payment status. It's what you have in your ERP system to begin with. And if I was a supplier to call you, you would go there to answer my questions. Well, let's provide that data to the suppliers. And then take it a step further. In today's day and age, you're going to see a lot of early payment options for suppliers out there. Let them take advantage of it. Don't be a hindrance. Be a value generator to your suppliers and pick the right platform for them. And you're going to win. You're definitely going to win.
Well, that's great advice. Absolutely. Yeah, I like the look at free and look at easy with eliminating process change. I think that will resonate with a lot of people. Let's have a look go ahead.
There's one other point I'd like to add for folks to think about, and that is when you're onboarding suppliers for any project, don't treat suppliers as one convenient group. They're all individuals. They have different needs, different challenges, different circumstances. Onboarding shouldn't be just a generic email template that goes out and say, hey, do this. You need to be personalized. You need to have phone calls. It's a project to get them onboarded, but do it the right way. Okay.
Brilliant. So the reason we're doing this topic is because, of course, there is friction between suppliers and customers. How can we use digital to help reduce the friction that exists between the buyer and seller, especially in the current business climate? You've mentioned some answers to this already, Mike, but is there anything you would further expand on in terms of using digital to reduce that friction?
Yeah, I think overall arching is the strategy of I want to be in a position to offer my suppliers data insights and immediate value. And I am going to reap the benefits. And what we got to think about is history, right? When you're doing a project, you have a lot of control over the folks within your own four walls. When you're doing projects that require external stakeholders, what we used to use was a big stick to get them to participate. And that big stick was, look, you'll do this with me or I'll have to go bring my business elsewhere. That's really not flying anymore. And what we got to look at is, how do I use carrots to get my suppliers on board? And if you find those carrots, you're going to be rewarded.
Yeah, absolutely. And same question to you, Kanda. What do you think we can do to eliminate friction with buyers and suppliers?
I think that anytime you can take hassle, you can take the mundane, you can take the repetitive, you can take low value out of how you transact business between the two parties, then you're ultimately adding value, because at the end of the day, both the supplier and the customer have very similar goals. And, I've said for many years to suppliers, we think that we're on opposite sides of the table, We're really not. We're really on the same side of the table. We're just looking at things through a bit of a different lens. And so ultimately, the goal of both parties is, I want this transaction, I want this relationship to be good, to be painless, to be beneficial, and to go smoothly. Because if all of those things happen, then both sides of the partnership are able to focus on what creates value for me, and ultimately that means it's got to be creating, although perhaps different, similar value propositions for in this case the supplier. And I think that the last year and a half of the pandemic has really brought some of this into focus for us all. That that doing business is difficult enough in good times. Doing business in times of whether it's global crisis, whether it's supply chain constraints, whether it's all of the things that the pandemic has thrown at us, has, I think, helped focus companies, both customer and suppliers, that we need to focus on those things that enable us to be successful and enable us to do business. And the less time we have to spend on, I want to call it the noise, that really isn't that, isn't that accretive for either of us. The less time we spend on that, the better. And so I think there's been a real move towards embracing this kind of change over the last 18 months. Hopefully we see that continue.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, yeah. I think our chairman always says, change is the only constant. So we better get ready for it and keep going. Earlier, Mac actually mentioned something on transparency and the importance of data. And I'd like to kind of touch on that point with you, Canada, also. And the question I want to ask is, can you give suppliers too much transparency? What's the balance?
Well, I think the answer is absolutely yes. You can give a supplier too much transparency, just as a supplier could potentially give a customer too much transparency. And there is, I think you do have to strike a balance, and the balance has to be based for me on sort of several key points. One is, just because something is beneficial for, in this case, the supplier to have, it still has to fundamentally be proper for me to share and disclose. And so I've certainly had situations where I've had suppliers ask for information that frankly was broader than they should get access to. Likewise, as a customer, I've been in situations where we as a customer have asked for information from suppliers that was broader or deeper than we probably should have access to. So I do think there's a balance. And I think, though, you have to look at that balance through a real reasonableness test, that you have to not look at the requests for transparency and for data access in terms of, ooh, is this going to give them a leg up? Is this going to, upset the balance in our partnership? But rather look at it through the lens that says, how does this help our partnership thrive and grow? And if you do that, it takes away the combativeness, and it makes it more of a partnership. And then the last comment I would make, and I think it's particularly important, growing importance over the last few years, is sometimes requests for data by either the customer or the supplier have to be looked at through a data privacy perspective. And sometimes information or just simply giving access for that transparency to another party, you always have to make sure that you're doing it in the context of, can this data be shown, and am I inadvertently allowing any access to other data that I shouldn't?
All great points.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
Is there anything that you would add to that, Mike, or shall I go on to our final question?
No, I was looking forward to that answer from Kanda because I did want to hear what her feelings on it, and I agree. As you go into this, it's looking at it through the lens of, is this going to be beneficial to the relationship? Is this going to provide value to my supplier that is going to aid the relationship to achieve a certain outcome? But it doesn't mean that I have to open up the kimono. I totally agree with that.
Brilliant. We're about to go on to our final talking point, but I would love the audience to submit questions. So if you do have any questions for Kanda or Mac, then please do submit them in the Q&A, and we'll be getting to those very shortly. So our last question, and I'll go to you first, Mac, and then on to you, Kanda, is that we've talked a lot about how suppliers benefit from transparency and access. How does it really benefit the customer?
That's a great point. So when we take a look at the failure rates of digital transformations today, if we're not going to do it right, chances are you're doomed to fail to begin with. So that's what we don't want to do. We want to have a successful transformation for the customer. We want to have the ability to seamlessly connect with our partners, our suppliers. We want to collaborate. We want to eliminate those tactical transactions, the tactical work that goes on in my organization, from as simple as answering supplier phone calls. That's something I'd love to take off my plate on day-to-day inquisitive type conversations. Boy, would I love to be able to incorporate social technology today to communicate. There's a whole new world that's coming up, and we need to take into account that workforce that's coming up and give them the tools that they're used to conduct work going forward the way work is going to be conducted. Again, I'll go back to something I said earlier. 3 out of 4 of your suppliers are not connected. Not connected means more manual transactions. That's what we want to get away from, and that's the whole goal of digitization.
Brilliant. And Kanda, back to you for kind of our final question. So we've talked a lot about the ways that suppliers benefit from transparency and access, and how does it really benefit the customer?
Well, I absolutely agree with Mac's comments. From a customer's perspective, the customer, whether it's in accounts payable, in finance, in procurement, don't want to be spending time taking phone calls or having a steady stream of chat messages or emails from a supplier asking questions that could easily or more easily be answered through some sort of access and transparency. And this is, I think, particularly clear in the onboarding process for new suppliers. The amount of toing and froing that happens to get a new supplier onboarded is frankly, it's not productive for the customer. It's not productive for the supplier. It's a necessary step. And so the customer absolutely benefits when things are easier for the supplier, particularly in terms of getting set up, and I'm going to call it the sort of the transactional activity that needs to happen. Getting a quote, receiving an invoice, paying an invoice, handling queries. That sort of thing is a necessary part of the business transaction flow, but it's not something that either party really want to be spending a whole lot of their resource on. So there's clearly benefits. And by the way, from a customer perspective, if it's easier for my supplier to do business with me, that means it's easier for me to have successful business done with that supplier. So it really is it is a win-win that comes out of it.
Yeah, Absolutely, thank you. It's good to have a positive note for the last question, absolutely. And I'm going to hand over to you, Matt, for just to summarize the kind of key points, and then we'll go into our Q&A.
Sure. Well, what I'd like to do is really speak about what your takeaways could be from this session you've had with us. And first and foremost, it starts with an internal change. It's a mindset change. And that mindset change is, I need to be a supplier-focused onboarding strategy. What's in it for the supplier? And that has to come from the top down, okay? Secondly, you want to provide instant value. And what is instant value? Again, I'll go back to, what do suppliers want? They want to get paid. They want money. That's why we do this. And what suppliers are looking for, and again, very easily served up in a self-service environment, invoice status, payment status, that type of visibility, and giving them an easy way to communicate as they're looking at that status to answer any questions they may have. Additional value add for services, for suppliers. One of the things that COVID has taught us is that the supply chains are very volatile today. And this pandemic caused a liquidity issue in our supply chain. And it's caused delays in shipments. It's caused suppliers to go out of business. So why can't we also maybe provide suppliers with early payment options? Something on the platform for them that is specific to them, that has no ramifications at all for them to use. That's something for you to look at. Flexible onboarding. Everybody's different. That supplier isn't just one entity. So you should provide various ways for them to onboard, various ways to connect, whether it be all the way from integrating to their ERP, to PO flips, to EDI transmissions, to send me the paper, I'll deal with it, but eventually we're going to move you off. It is a journey from that perspective. Enhanced master data. We spoke of, you speak about suppliers, and I'm sure Candace would echo this. There's supplier portal fatigue out in the marketplace. Unfortunately, again, the P2P systems are designed for a buyer, not the supplier. So each supplier has to do this it's iterative process over and over again. Again, got to look at the value. Is it worth the change? And we want to get away from that. There's probably one location for suppliers to facilitate invoice submissions, regardless of the P2P platform. Simplified requirements. Don't make it hard for them. Remember, they're not used to change. We aren't wired for change. Make it as simple as possible. And again, I can't stress this enough, a clear mandate from the top of the company to the suppliers. We're in this boat together, and we're going to win together. That's the message.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. Let's launch into our Q&A, because a couple of the questions are really related to what you've just talked about. So perfect.
Sure.
The first one I wanted to mention was, so you've mentioned a bit about kind of personalizing your interactions with suppliers. And I'll go to you first on this question, Mac, and then the next question I'll go to Kanda.
Yeah.
But this question, you talked about personalizing your relationship with the supplier, but for shared services, we hear a lot about standardization and centralization, and that being the key to efficiency and productivity. How do we balance that with being standard, but also personal?
Well, I'm totally in line with the standardization, but to get participation, you need to get personal. Because the way it's been done in the past has been a one-size-fits-all approach. The email template goes out and says, hi, supplier, this is what I want you to do now, period. It needs to be more personalized. What's in it for them? And one size isn't fit all, as I mentioned, with the integration flexibility that you need. So it's really looking at personalization to increase participation. I may trade I like that one.
You had it here first. And Kanda, a question that's come through that I'd love to direct to you is, if you let suppliers have transparency or access, do you create any InfoSec or privacy risk?
I think the answer is you don't necessarily, but you need to be aware of it. And I kind of touched on this earlier about, I think that anytime you give access, and by the way, more broadly, not just to a supplier, anytime you open up access to a system, you need to be mindful of what are the controls. And it's not something from a finance or a procurement perspective necessarily, but that most companies will have a pretty robust process that says we have an InfoSec team, we have a GRC, governance risk, controls team that you would involve to say, is this appropriate? Is there anything that we haven't thought of? And so what I would say is, of course, there's a risk, but most companies now have processes in place that so long as you follow those, it should be fine. But I do think it's something that you have to be mindful of. And that, by the way, would apply even if you're not yet automated. You get a query comes in on the phone from a supplier, you still have to be, your team have to be aware of what can they share and what can't they share and under what circumstances. So for me, it's just, you need to know the framework in which you can operate comfortably and manage and control the risk for your company.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so it's a risk, but it's something you can mitigate with the right planning. Understand. Okay, yeah. Cool. A question for Mac now is, you mentioned portal fatigue. What is that and how do we eliminate it? Someone's asked.
What portal fatigue has been born out of traditional procurement technology platforms. What do I mean by that? When you look at a traditional P2P platform, its inherent design is what we would call a hub and a spoke design, meaning the buyer is central in the middle and the spokes are the connection points to the suppliers. It's basically a one-to-one type of, well, for the buyer, it's one-to-many, but for the supplier, it's a one-to-one relationship or connection. As each supplier there, or each customer maybe puts in a new P2P platform, has them join the same platform as another customer, they have to have a whole new login, a whole new profile, and it's just, it's not efficient from their standpoint. Again, it goes to the value. It's not of value to them to do it anymore because it's an administrative nightmare.
Brilliant. Yeah, I understand.
How we would eliminate it? How would we eliminate it? Yeah, is look at, when you're looking at platforms, get away from the hub and spoke and look at a network that's more like or akin to LinkedIn, where all the parties join once. And I don't have a situation where I have to keep doing the same thing over and over again. Right? It makes it life a little bit easier for all involved.
The last question, I think we've got time for one more question, and I'll direct this to you, Candace, to finish off. And that is, how do we get buy-in for digital transformation of our supplier relationship management?
It's a great question, and I think I have a couple quick thoughts on that. One is that from a company's perspective and from a procurement leadership and a finance leadership perspective, you can help drive the buy-in by showing the benefit. And it's, being able to translate the benefit of having this good supplier partnership into terms that resonate within your company. Now, for different companies, that might be slightly different how it resonates. But for a lot of companies, it comes back to ROI. And being able to show that And Mac has pointed out some really great statistics in some of the earlier parts of our webinar. But if you can cut down the number of, we'll call them tactical, sort of low-value inquiries that you get, the amount of time, the amount of resource that your accounts payable team, that your vendor management team, that your procurement team have to spend fielding these questions, those things can absolutely be translated into savings. Dollar savings, resource savings, time savings. And all of those resonate when you start to say, this is why this is important. And then I think the other thing for me, which is maybe a little bit harder to show initially in an ROI, but it will show up long term, is anytime you can move your critical supplier relationships from tactical to strategic, that absolutely has a long-term and lasting benefit. A little bit harder to quantify in the early days of that, but over time, the value is immense that an organization can benefit from.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Well, sadly, that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for taking the time to put together your thoughts and deliver them today. To the audience, this has been recorded, and in about half an hour, it will be available on demand. So if you do want to share with your colleagues or anyone that you think finds it useful, then please do. Of course, myself, Kanda, and Mac are all available on LinkedIn. So if you want to get in touch with any further questions, then please feel free to do so. And yeah, please check out SSON for the next webinar that you'd like to be part of, where it's all available on there. But thank you so much to Tradeshift, to Kanda, to Mac for taking the time to talk to us about supplier relationship management. I hope you found it as useful as I have. Good evening.
Thank you.